Today I'm excited to partner with Cashmerette to sew and share their Catskills Jacket. This is a simple style bias cut jacket with integrated sleeves and French seams. I've left a link to the pattern below so you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and sew along with me. So grab that pattern, cut out your fabric, mark your notches, and let's get started. The pieces that we're cutting for this pattern will be cut on the bias. You can use a ruler to make sure that the lines on your pattern piece are parallel to your selvage. And do this for each piece. With all of the pattern pieces being cut on the bias, you're going to want to sew very carefully so you don't stretch the fabric out. I'm going to be using a walking foot for this project just to make sure that both sides of my fabric are feeding evenly. For additional reinforcement of the center, front, and neckline seams, the pattern calls for stay tape. You're going to be applying this fusible stay tape along both of your front pieces at the center, front, and your necklines. Place the stay tape 5/8 of an inch away from the center front edges and fuse in place. And do the same along both of your front necklines. Once you've applied your stay tape to both of your front pieces along the center, front, and neckline, do the same thing for your back pieces at your neckline only. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your center front facings and your back neckline facings, as well as to the wrong side of your lower front facings and your lower back facings. Now we're ready to prepare our front French darts. Fold the fabric in half along the dart, wrong sides together, so that the dart legs align and pin in place. Do this for both of your front darts, and then we're going to sew these dart seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that first dart seam is sewn, flip your fabric along the dart so that it's right sides together. And then pin or clip in place. Do this for both of the front darts and then sew these dart seams at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now using a tailor's ham if you have one, press your darts downward. Now place your back pieces wrong sides together. Pin or clip your center back seam. Sew the center back seam from the bottom to the neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then press your seams open. Now that I've pressed that seam open, I'm going to fold the fabric along this seam so that it's right sides together. And pin or clip in place. And then sew that back seam once again with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then press your French seam to one side. Now we're going to sew French seams for the shoulder seams just as we did for the center back seam. Place your front pieces on top of your back piece, wrong sides together. And pin both shoulder seams. Once we have both shoulders pinned in place, we're going to sew from wrist to neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance for both sides. And press your seams open. Now that my 1/4 inch shoulder seams are sewn and pressed open, I'm going to fold the fabric right sides together along those seams and pin those shoulder seams once again. Now that I have those shoulder seams pinned in place, we're going to sew from the wrist to the neckline once again with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and then press the seams toward the back of the garment. Now that the shoulder seams are complete, we can sew our side seams. Fold the front and back pieces so that they're wrong sides together, and pin or clip your side seams matching your notches. Do this on both sides. We're going to sew our underarm side seams just a little bit differently. We're going to start by sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Sew from the waist to the end of your sleeve and do this for both sides of the garment. And then press those seams open. Now that we've sewn that seam at 3/8 of an inch, we want to trim it down to 1/8 of an inch. And do this on both sides. Turn your garment inside out so that the jacket is facing right sides together. And then pin your underarm side seams once again. Once those seams are pinned, we're going to sew them once again from the bottom to the end of the sleeve with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then press those seams toward the back of the garment. Place your back neckline facing pieces right sides together and pin down the center back. Sew your center back facing seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Trim your seam allowance down to 3/8 of an inch. Additionally, you can choose to finish these seams on both sides, but with the interfacing applied, you shouldn't have any problem with these seams fraying. Now we're going to attach our center front facings to this back facing. Place your center front facings right sides together with the shoulder seams of the back facing and pin in place. Sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press your seams open and trim your seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch. And once again, if you prefer, you can finish those edges on either side. To finish the outer edges of this facing, we're going to take it to the ironing board and fold and press all of the outer edges all the way around by 1/4 of an inch. Now that I have all of those outside edges pressed to the inside by 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and top stitch all around those outer edges with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, all around until I'm back at the opposite bottom edge. Place your lower back facing pieces right sides together and pin this seam matching your notches. So with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, press your seams open and trim them down to 3/8 of an inch. Place your lower front facing pieces right sides together with the lower back facings, and we're going to pin together these side seams. Make sure that all of your pieces are oriented in such a way that the notches are all along the top. Sew these seams at 5/8 of an inch and then trim your seams down to 3/8 and press them open. Now that those seams are sewn, we're going to finish the bottom unnotched edges, just as we did for the other facing pieces. Folding and pressing those bottom raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and then top stitching that folded edge in place from one side all the way to the other with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we're going to attach the bottom slanted edges of both of our separate facing sets. Place the bottom slanted edges right sides together and pin in place. Sew straight across these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, trim your seams down and press them open. And now you should have one big facing loop. Now with right sides together, we're going to attach the facing to the main garment. I'm going to start my pinning at the center back of my facing and the center back of my garment with raw edges matching pin in place. And then continue pinning all around that facing. Matching your shoulder seams, the bottom and top edges of your center fronts, and then straight across the bottom of the jacket, again matching your seams. Now that I have that facing pinned all the way around, we're going to attach this facing to the main garment all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once you reach the corner, stop your stitching, pivot your fabric with your needle still inside, and then continue your stitching all the way around. Here's the center front of my garment. I want to trim the seams at the top and bottom corners so that there's less bulk here when we turn the facing to the inside of the garment. Do this trimming for both of your center fronts, trimming close to the corner stitching line but not beyond. Because only the facings are interfaced but not the main bodice, I'm going to choose to finish my seams here. You can use a zigzag stitch or your serger. I'm going to be using my serger and serge that facing seam all the way around that loop. Now we can turn the entire facing to the inside of the garment, poking out those corners at the top and bottom center fronts. And then give all of your facing seams a really good press all the way around. Note that when you press the facing to the inside of the garment, you want that facing seam to slightly favor the inside of the garment, so that where that facing meets the edge of the garment, that facing material is slightly rolled to the inside of the garment. This way it won't be visible from the outside. Once you have everything nicely pressed, we're going to top stitch the facing to the garment all the way around. You're going to be sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you can increase your stitch length to about 3.5 or 4 millimeters. At the seam lines at your shoulder seams, center back, your side seams, and your bottom center back, we're going to further reinforce that facing by stitching in the ditch in all of those seams. Sewing from the outside of the garment and stitching just as far as the width of that facing, you're going to place your needle directly into the groove of the existing seam and stitch from the top of that facing to the bottom of the facing, backstitching at both ends. Do this for each of the areas where your facing seam meets one of the seams in your bodice. If you're going to add elastic to the bottom of your sleeve for view C, take the bottoms of your sleeve to your ironing board and press up those raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. And once you've folded it to the inside 1/4 inch, press and fold it once more to the wrong side by an additional 5/8 inch. Do this for both sleeves. To form the casing, you're going to edge stitch close to this inner fold all the way around, leaving about a 1 inch gap near the underarm seam so that we can insert our elastic. And again, do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. For the sleeve elastics, you're going to cut 2 pieces of 3/8 inch wide elastic to measure the distance around your bicep right above your elbow, plus 1 inch. Cut 1 for the bottom of each sleeve. I'm going to place a safety pin through one short edge of my elastic and draw it through the casing in the opening that I left in my stitching. Secure the ends of the elastic in place and then try on your garment to make sure you're happy with the length of that elastic. Once you're happy with the fit, overlap those edges and zigzag stitch back and forth a few times to secure. And then you can pull your elastic to the inside. Sew close the gap in your stitching following your original stitching line. Apply your elastic to the bottom of your other sleeve in the same way. If you're finishing the ends of your sleeves for views A or B, you're going to take the bottom raw edges of your sleeve to your ironing board and press them to the wrong side by 3/8 inch, and then you're going to press them one more time by an additional 5/8 inch. Do this for both sleeves. Once you have your folds pressed in place, you're going to sew 1/8 inch away from this inner fold all the way around, and do this for both sleeves. If you're going to be using buttons and thread loops on the front of your jacket, your front pattern piece has your markings for your size. I'm going to transfer these markings to the right side of my jacket using pins. With these markings in place, now I'm ready to sew my thread loops. For a video tutorial on how to create your thread loops, refer to the link in your pattern instructions. And for your left center front, you can use the same button markings from your pattern piece to mark where you're going to be sewing your buttons. And using a needle and thread, you can sew your buttons in place. And if you're going to be sewing hooks and eyes to your garment instead of buttons, you'll find your hook and eye placement guide on your center front facing piece. You can mark those placements onto your left and right center front fabric and sew your hooks and eyes to opposite sides of your facing for all 8 of your hook and eye placements. Once you have your center front closures in place, give everything a nice press and you're all done with your jacket. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.